The wind was the first master of this land, a tireless sculptor that carved canyons from rock and fortitude from men. It screamed across the high plains, scouring dust from the parched earth and hurling it against the solitary clapboard house that stood as a lonely testament to endurance. Inside, Gideon moved with the quiet purpose of a man who wasted nothing. Not a movement, not a word, not a breath. He was as much a part of the landscape as the weathered mesas, his face a testament to sun and solitude. With the day's work done, the fences mended where wild mustangs had tested them and the cattle lowing softly in the corral, he stood at his window. The scent of pine from his stove filled the small, sturdy rooms as he watched the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the cruel beauty of the territory in hues of bruised purple and burning orange. It was in that dying light that he saw it, a flicker of movement where there should be only stillness. It was not the familiar shape of a coyote or the lumbering gait of a stray steer. It was small, fragile, and achingly out of place, a smudge of dark color against the endless ochre canvas. Curiosity, an indulgence he rarely afforded himself, pulled him to the door. He saddled his mare, her breath misting in the cooling air, and rode out, the rhythmic creak of leather a familiar comfort against the rising moan of the evening wind. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a woman, crumpled at the base of a lonely rock formation, a heap of dark fabric and utter stillness. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dust, his hand resting instinctively on the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. He approached with caution, his steps slow and measured. She was lying face down, her hair, black as a raven's wing, fanned out around her head. She wore a dress of a deep, earthy brown silk, the likes of which he had never seen. It was torn at the hem and coated in a fine layer of red dust, yet it fit her form with a strange elegance that was an affront to the brutal landscape. He knelt, his movements gentle, and carefully turned her over. Her face was pale, her features delicate, and her eyes were closed. For a long moment he thought she was dead. But then he saw it. A faint tremor of breath, a slight flutter of her eyelids. She was alive. In a single, fluid motion, he unhooked the canteen from his saddle, uncorked it, and gently lifted her head, letting a few drops of precious water touch her cracked lips. Her eyes opened. They were dark, almond-shaped, and filled with a terror so profound it struck him silent. She was Chinese, a stranger in a land that was barely familiar to its own people. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, who she belonged to. Quentin Shaw, his neighbor to the east, had been boasting for weeks in town about the bride he'd purchased from San Francisco, speaking of her as one might speak of a new piece of livestock. Shaw's ranch was a monument to his greed, but his character was as barren as the salt flats. To have cast her out here was a death sentence. Gideon looked from her frightened face to the vast, unforgiving wilderness stretching in every direction. His moral code was simple, forged in solitude and hardship. You did not let a living thing suffer if you had the power to prevent it. He scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile weight against his chest. She stiffened with a gasp but was too weak to struggle. "You're safe now," he said, the words gruff and unused, spoken more to the wind than to her. He carried her to his mare, mounted, and settled her in front of him, turning his horse back toward the small, solitary light of his home, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. He brought her into the house, where the warmth and the smell of coffee and wood smoke stood in stark contrast to the cold, desolate plains. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only one he had, and pulled a thick wool blanket over her. Her eyes followed his every move, wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He saw the way she clutched the fabric of her worn brown cheongsam, the silk garment a last, tattered link to a world that no longer existed for her. Without a word, he moved to the stove, stoking the fire and putting a pot of broth on to heat. Words were a currency he spent sparingly, and in this case they were useless. They shared no language but the universal one of need and aid. When the broth was warm, he ladled it into a tin cup and brought it to her. He gestured for her to sit up, and when she did so, her movements stiff with pain, he handed her the cup. She hesitated, her gaze flickering from his face to the steaming liquid, as if expecting a trick. He simply waited, his expression unreadable. Finally, her small, trembling hands closed around the cup. She took a slow, tentative sip, then another, the warmth seeming to seep back into her soul. He watched her, this strange, beautiful woman who had fallen into his life like a star plummeting to earth. He noted the quiet dignity in her posture, even in her weakened state. When she finished, she held the empty cup out to him, her gaze meeting his for the first time without pure terror. There was a question in it, a silent inquiry. He took the cup, then pointed to himself. Gideon, the name felt strange on his tongue. He then gestured to her. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, her voice a soft, musical whisper. May, the name hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge. He gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement and retreated to the other side of the small room, pulling over a wooden chair to sit by the fire. He would watch over her through the night. As he sat in the flickering firelight, listening to the sound of her soft, even breathing as she finally succumbed to a healing sleep, a feeling akin to gratitude settled over him. His life had been a solitary, predictable path he had chosen. Now a new, uncertain line had intersected his, and for the first time in years, he did not know what the sunrise would bring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the floorboards when May awoke. She saw Gideon by the open door, sharpening a tool on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a grounding, peaceful sound. He had given her space, and she understood the gesture. For the first time in months, she felt a sliver of safety. A sense of purpose stirred in her. She was not one to be a burden. She folded the blanket with precise, neat corners and washed her face and hands in a small basin of fresh water he had left for her. When he turned and saw her, he simply nodded and gestured toward the table where 2 plates of biscuits and bacon were waiting. They ate in a comfortable silence, a new domesticity settling into the corners of the small cabin. The peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves. A magnificent black stallion galloped into the yard, ridden by a man who seemed to consume all the air around him. Quinton Shaw dismounted with an arrogant flourish, his expensive leather coat and polished boots an insult to the dusty, hard-working land. "Gideon!" he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've come for my property." Gideon rose from the table, moving to stand in the doorway, his body a solid, immovable barrier. He did not raise his voice. "She's not property." Shaw behind him. May had shrunk back into the shadows of the room, the color draining from her face. Shaw sneered, his eyes flicking past Gideon to catch a glimpse of May. "I have a bill of sale from San Francisco that says otherwise." She proved to be disobedient. A night in the wilderness was meant to teach her some gratitude. "Now hand her over." Gideon's jaw tightened. His voice was dangerously low, as cold and hard as the iron skillet on his stove. "The lesson is over. She's staying here." A flicker of amusement crossed Shaw's face. "Here? With you? In this shack? I am a reasonable man. I'll even compensate you for your trouble." He reached into his coat. "She's not for sale," Gideon said, each word an unshakable stone. The amusement vanished from Shaw's face, replaced by a dark, possessive fury. "You will regret this, homesteader. That woman belongs to me, and I always get what is mine." He spun on his heel, swung himself onto his stallion with violent grace, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and palpable menace hanging in the air. Gideon turned back into the quiet room. May was standing with her back against the far wall, her hands clenched into fists. She was trembling, but her chin was held high. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but the flicker of a defiant, resilient fire. The line had been drawn. The following week, Gideon knew he couldn't put off a trip into the town of Stone Creek. Supplies were low, and Shaw's threat lingered. Leaving May alone was a risk, but taking her with him was a public declaration. He chose the danger he could face head-on. He loaded the wagon, and May, understanding his unspoken request, returned from the cabin wearing her mended brown cheongsam, her dark hair brushed until it shone. She held her head with a quiet grace that was its own form of armor. As they pulled up to the general store, the town's activity seemed to slow. Eyes followed them, and whispers coiled in the air like heat haze. Shaw had already been at work, poisoning the well of public opinion. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. Mr. Miller, the proprietor, a balding man with kind eyes, was the only one who met their gaze directly. "Morning, Gideon," he said, nodding a polite greeting. His eyes rested on May for a moment, not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity. As Miller gathered the flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges from Gideon's list, other customers shuffled pointedly to the far side of the store. May stood silently, examining a display of colorful sewing threads, refusing to acknowledge the hostility. As Gideon paid, Miller leaned in slightly. "Shaw's been telling stories," he said, his voice low. "Says you stole his property." Gideon just met his gaze. "She's a person, Miller. Not a horse to be traded." Miller held his stare for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Figured as much. It was a small gesture, but it was an alliance. That evening, as Gideon mended a harness by lantern light, May sat nearby on a small stool, expertly patching a hole in a pair of his worn work trousers. The simple, domestic act was more profound than any conversation. They were building a life stitch by stitch in the face of the storm. Shaw's retribution was insidious. A few days later, Gideon found a fence line to his northern pasture cut clean through, scattering a dozen head of cattle. Took him 2 grueling days to round them up. He returned, exhausted and grim, to find May waiting with a hot meal, her eyes filled with concern. She had found the cut fence and understood its meaning. The attacks grew more cunning. The shared well he and a few other small ranchers used was fouled one night. The water turned brackish. It forced him and May into the backbreaking daily chore of hauling water from a spring 2 miles away. The shared labor, however, did not break them. It forged them together. They worked in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, a team bound by necessity and a growing mutual respect. She started a small, tenacious garden near the house, coaxing green shoots from the unforgiving soil, her patience a quiet rebellion against the harshness of their circumstances. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle, May pointed to the weapon. "Gun," she said, her pronunciation careful. He stopped, surprised. She had been listening, absorbing his few words. He nodded slowly. "Gun." Then he pointed to the table. "Table," she repeated the word, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it transformed her face. From then on, their evenings were filled with lessons. He would point to objects: cup, fire, bread, horse, and she would repeat the words, her mind quick and eager. In return, she taught him a few of her own words, her soft, melodic tones a strange and beautiful music in the rustic cabin. One night, he found himself simply watching her as she named the constellations in her language through the window. A powerful, protective urge swelled in his chest, an emotion so fierce it startled him. It was more than duty. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. She did not flinch, but leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, as profound and binding as any vow. It was in that moment he knew. His fight was no longer just about principle. It was about her. In the quiet space between them, a fragile, unspoken love began to take root. The season began to turn, and Shaw escalated his campaign from property to law. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was made of jelly, rode into Gideon's yard with Shaw at his side, holding a piece of paper like a royal decree. "Gideon," the sheriff began, avoiding his eyes, "Mr. Shaw here has filed a formal complaint. He has a bill of sale for the woman." Gideon's eyes were fixed on Shaw, a cold, steady gaze. "I told you," Gideon said flatly. "She's not property." Shaw laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The law says otherwise, you stubborn fool." "Sheriff," I'm ordering you to enforce my claim." May had come to the doorway, drawn by the voices. She did not hide. She stood straight and tall, her gaze on Shaw clear and unafraid. Her fear had been burned away by injustice, leaving behind a core of pure steel. "My name," she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence, "is May. I am not property." The simple declaration, spoken in clear English, stunned Shaw into silence. Even Sheriff Brody looked taken aback. "It talks back now, does it?" Shaw snarled, his face darkening with rage. "Sheriff, do your duty." But the moment had shifted. May was not a frightened creature. She was a woman speaking for herself. Gideon stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. "The law you're talking about, Shaw," he said quietly, "is for cattle and land, not for people. Now you and the sheriff can get off my property." Sheriff Brody, seeing the unyielding resolve in Gideon's eyes and hearing the undeniable humanity in May's voice, finally found a sliver of courage. "I reckon this is a civil matter, Mr. Shaw," he mumbled. "You'll have to take it to the circuit judge." Shaw stared, his face contorted with fury. He had been defied by a homesteader, a foreign woman, and a spineless lawman. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice a venomous promise as he galloped away, leaving the certainty of a coming storm. The storm broke on a night when the world held its breath, the dry air crackling with an unseen charge. Gideon was checking on the livestock when he saw it. A flicker of orange against the dark silhouette of his small barn, a hungry, unnatural light. He broke into a run, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. By the time he reached it, the flames were already licking up the dry timber walls. A monstrous thing birthed from a lit rag and a bottle of kerosene. As he grabbed buckets, he saw May emerge from the house, her face illuminated by the terrifying glow. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, mirroring determination. She grabbed the second bucket and ran with him to the well. They worked in the hellish heat, a desperate, two-person army against the inferno. The world shrank to the splash of water, the agonizing run, the hiss of steam, and the frantic race back to the well. Soot blackened their faces and smoke seared their lungs. He saw in her the same unbreakable grit that allowed homesteaders to tear a living from this unforgiving land, a strength he recognized as his own. They fought until their muscles screamed, pushing their bodies past every limit. Finally, the fire, starved and beaten back, began to retreat. They had won. They stood side by side, gasping for breath in the smoky air. The barn was a ruin, half standing and blackened, but it was still there. He turned to look at her in the flickering, dying light. He saw not the fragile woman he had found in the desert, but a warrior, partner. A wave of emotion, raw and overwhelming, broke through the dam of his stoicism. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her soot-stained cheek. "May," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She leaned into his touch, her eyes, luminous in the firelight, searching his. In that moment, all the unspoken words, all the shared hardships and growing tenderness, converged. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence and awe, a promise made in the ashes of their home. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, a gesture of absolute trust and belonging. The storm had come, and they had weathered it together. Defeat was an acid in Shaw's gut. Publicly humiliated, his power in the town shattered, he retreated to his ranch, consumed by an obsessive rage. The law was too slow, the town had turned against him. There was only one solution left in his twisted mind: obliteration. He gathered the 3 hard-faced men on his payroll, armed them, and planned his final assault. They would ride at dusk. They would burn the house this time and everyone in it. At the homestead, Gideon knew Shaw would retaliate. He spent the afternoon cleaning his rifle and pistol, his movements methodical and calm. As the sun began to set, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. For riders moving fast. "Inside," Gideon said, his voice grim. He took his position by the front window, rifle ready. May did not cower. She took the second rifle, the one she had watched him clean 100 times, and went to the small window on the back wall, checking the load as she had seen him do. "Gideon, give me the woman and we'll let you live," Shaw screamed from the yard. The only answer was the shattering of a window pane next to Shaw's head as Gideon fired a warning shot. A volley of gunfire tore into the cabin walls in response. Gideon returned fire with measured precision, while from the back, a second rifle shot rang out. One of Shaw's men cried out, grabbing an arm where May's deliberate, non-lethal shot had torn through his sleeve. The attackers were stunned. They had expected to lay siege to one man, not two armed defenders. Suddenly, from the direction of the town, came the sound of more hoofbeats. A posse of armed ranchers and townsmen, led by Mr. Miller and a determined-looking Sheriff Brody, rode into the yard. "Shaw, drop your weapons. You're surrounded," Brody yelled, his voice finally carrying the weight of the law. Shaw's men threw down their guns. But Shaw was beyond reason. He let out a primal scream of rage and spurred his horse directly at the cabin. His pistol raised, aimed at the window where Gideon stood. Gideon fired. Shaw fired. 2 shots rang out as one. Shaw jerked in the saddle, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before tumbling to the ground. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the sound of a lone horse galloping into the darkness. The sunrise painted the eastern sky with strokes of pale pink and soft gold, bringing with it a profound, soul-deep quiet. The violence was over. Neighbors, the same people who had once eyed May with suspicion, now moved about the yard with quiet purpose, patching the bullet holes in the cabin walls and offering calloused hands in friendship. A month passed. The scorched timbers of the barn were cleared away, replaced by a new frame, built strong with the help of a community that had found its moral center. The scars on the land were healing, and so were the scars on their hearts. Silas and May worked side by side, their unspoken love settling into a comfortable, everyday rhythm. It was in the shared glances across the dinner table, the easy silence as they watched the stars come out, a universe of understanding passing between them without a single word. One evening, they stood on the small porch of their repaired cabin, looking out at the vast expanse of land that was theirs. The prairie grasses glowed amber in the setting sun. He reached over and took her hand, his large, rough fingers lacing through her slender ones. "Felt like coming home." "My home," she said softly, looking not at the land, but at him. He squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotions he was still learning how to name. His life had once been a solitary, straight line. She had not been a disruption to it. She had been its destination. "Our home," Gideon corrected her, his voice rough but clear. He drew her closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder. They stood together, 2 solitary figures no more, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the promise of 1,000 more sunrises to come.